having the same thing communicated in multiple places, we realized not everybody learns or grabs the message through an email. Some people learn visually by seeing a step 1, 2, 3. So by covering a couple of those different areas for the same thing, we had a lot more success at people understanding or knowing in advance, oh, here's the 3, 4 stages I'm going to go through.
Hi, I'm Johnny Campbell, CEO and co-founder of SocialTalent. And this week on the podcast, we're speaking with Paul Peterson from Grant Thornton Canada about candidate experience. Paul, you're very welcome to the podcast. Could you give our audience a little introduction to yourself? Where in the world are you? What do you do? And maybe something interesting about yourself as well you want to share with our audience.
Thanks, Johnny. I'm delighted to be here today. I'm working today out of Toronto, Canada, and I've been with Grant Thornton about coming up on 15 years. I got a team of about 20 or so amazing people here, and we recruit across all of Canada from everything from co-op interns right up to C-level folks internally for the firm. The only what exciting thing about myself, I don't know, my strategy has always been to hire people that are smarter than me because they make me look really good, and that's worked really well for the last 14, 15 years. So I'm going to keep doing that one.
We should get your team on here then instead of you, Paul. Get the real insights. Paul, I personally, I didn't share this with you before, but I cut my teeth doing accountancy recruitment. I used to hire for qualified accountants. I did a lot of audit work as well. I'm very familiar with the firm and some of the different nuances, but maybe our audience isn't so familiar with Grant Thornton and maybe some of the skill sets you hire for. Maybe could you share a little bit about the firm, the organization, and for those who have never hired in Canada before, maybe some of the market dynamics and challenges of the market as well?
You bet. So Grant Thornton, in generally speaking, in professional services, the majority of the people that we're looking for are people that have got a really strong financial backgrounds and they have a desire to get their CPA designation or their Chartered Professional Accountant designation. Has different names across the world, but it's that general idea. From that, it builds a foundation that people go into all kinds of different areas of consulting or tax or other kinds of advisory works. But that's generally the foundation of what we look for, and it builds out from there. The other areas that matter a lot to us, really just a lot of internal stuff that also makes a difference. We'll have a lot of your standard, marketing, IT things that you would at any large national firm.
And what kind of numbers? How big is the firm globally? How big is the firm in Canada?
Within Canada, we're about 3,000, 3,500. The numbers kind of go up and down
Okay.
depending, where you count or you don't. But in Canada, we're across, I think, 5 or 6 time zones. I forget if it's 5 or 6, I forget. And about 7,000 kilometers. So the geography is absolutely massive. And we've got about 100 offices across the country. And we're in a lot of smaller communities because that's where our clients are, as well as the major centers. So geography wise, we're really covering from one side of the country clear to the next, and most major larger cities in between.
So I've only ever hired for folks in Newfoundland, weirdly, in Halifax, of all places. That's a whole different story. So I'm not usually familiar with the market dynamics of Canada. So high unemployment, low unemployment, very mobile workforce, not very mobile, lots of international folks, not lots of international folks. Talk me through those dynamics.
Yeah, so it's yeah, reasonably low unemployment. I think lower compared to a lot of Europe, not quite as low as the United States, but generally we're in between what you'd find in the UK and what you'd find in the US. Probably a little better than one and not quite as good as the other. Some of the different dynamics that come is that we do have mobility, not as much as we'd like, actually. We'd love it if people moved around the country more. It's not a Grant Thornton thing. I'd actually argue it's more of a Canadian thing that people just don't, culturally, for whatever reason, we don't tend to move around as much. I've got lots of friends in the US that recruit, and you can hire people out of one city, and they're happy to go to any one of 5 or 6 or 7 places and move around every 5, 6 years. Uh, yeah, I'd love to have that opportunity. We do have a lot more international folks in the last, 5, 6 years, and that's been a fabulous opportunity for us. It's really exciting to see a lot of the skills that people bring in from elsewhere, and how do we adapt and how can we use those. Those folks are a lot more willing to move around, which helps us as well.
So a lot of our audience may be familiar with your competitors, the other accounting firms, tax firms, advisory firms, consulting firms. And maybe a comment, this may be unfair, fair, you tell me, is that they're all the same. All very good of a certain standard. When you get to a certain standard, the size of Grant Thornton, great firms, you're going to get a great training environment. It's going to be great in your resume or CV. You're going to get into the same work. But listen, auditing is auditing, tax is tax. What's the difference? Is that fair? And if there's even an element of fairness to that comment, how does one go about differentiating yourself for the talent market?
I hate to admit it, but there is some degree of fairness to the comment. The if it's not so much in the everyday work, but what people actually do at each place isn't demonstrably different all the time. In many respects, you could say audit is audit and tax is tax and consulting can be consulting. Clients can change, but the methodology and how you do it, it might not vary dramatically. And people in the industry do struggle to explain a lot of the differences. Does it make a difference here or there? And we came across this early on when I was early with the firm and we were recruiting at senior levels. We struggled initially to explain some of the differences, and we really quickly learned that hey, there was a difference at least for us. And how did we articulate it? For us, it was really culture, and culture and experience really go hand in hand. So for us, it was about how do we tell people that yeah, even though audit might be audit or tax might be tax, the experience that you'll get or the experience that we deliver to the people in doing it is what makes a difference. I suppose the one way I explain it to people is what people does might not be what people do might not be as different, but the how they do it is what really we talk about a lot more, which is a lot of the experience and the culture.
So how do you go about translating that? Because obviously, to your point, if the work is broadly similar, right? And I'd argue a software engineer doing coding in X is the same as coding in Y, and maybe there's a product differentiator there for folks go, I want to build that product, not this other product. But when you talk about the team, the culture, the environment, the how do you start communicating that through a hiring process, through employer branding, through experience? You know, what did that look like when you first hit upon this, and how has that evolved, or how does your team think about the experience of a candidate? Different, let's say, to an employee, of course, retention and so on and so forth is really important about the culture of how you work. But when you're kind of selling that up front or trying to communicate that up that front, how do you go about approaching that, Paul?
One of the things we do is we make sure that it's the main thing that a recruiter is focusing on is the experience that they deliver, and we measure as much as we possibly can. It's not perfect, but recruiters even have their own individual scorecards, their own dashboards, which measure as much as we can of the experience that they deliver to candidates. So if you decline a candidate for whatever valid reason, that candidate has the opportunity to complete a survey and say, what was my experience like? And it's tied back to the recruiter that gave them that message. And it's hard. If you're a recruiter, you've got to turn around and tell somebody in the nicest way, thanks, but no thanks. And then right away we're going to survey that person and say, tell us how your experience was. It's it's difficult to have them be super positive, but we still do it because we learn from it. And we learn how can we, continually make ourselves even better? How do we give a good experience? Makes a huge difference. But if the recruiters are focused about that all the way along through the whole journey, it makes a big difference in the experience we deliver. If they know that yeah, somebody's going to give commentary on here's the experience I deliver. I'm going to give the best experience I possibly can.
Do you look differently, Paul, around, let's say, digital experiences versus human experiences? A candidate might have an experience applying for a job, which doesn't involve talking to any of your recruiting team. It's about, maybe the job description, the application process, the form, the automations in there. Do you measure everything or just the human pieces? And is there a difference?
So one of the best ways that we measure what we do is we've got this huge chart on the wall. It's about 6 feet long and about 3 feet high. And the columns we have in it represent every one of the possible touch points that somebody could have in their candidate journey. Then what we try to do is we say, in a perfect world, what do we want somebody to feel at that stage of the experience? Because the experience, it's not just about giving information. That isn't hard. The hard part is what do you want somebody to feel along the way? And so we broke down to 5 or 6 emotions, and we said at every one of those high 20s, low 30s touch points, I forget the exact number, what do we want somebody to feel? And then we tried to say, and how can we measure this? And it's not perfect, but we've learned as time goes on, different questions on surveys or how people respond to different things that are put in front of them gives us some indication of, oh, we think they're actually inspired by this, or gee, they're kind of intrigued by this. Gee, somebody's shows you can see the excitement in them when they're at this stage of the process, and that helps us know, hey, are we successful in what we're trying to do, or are we lacking here? And every recruiter along the way knows that we're measuring as much as we can, and we don't even always keep it confidential. Like when a recruiter declines somebody at the resume review stage or after they had a phone screen, every candidate has a chance to fill out a really brief survey, which is largely, tell me, how was your experience? A simple question, open text box, and what you thought. We share that with the whole team so everybody can learn. So if Bob rejects somebody and somebody's like, yeah, Bobby just called me, really didn't give me any information, this wasn't really helpful, everybody sees that, so we all learn from it. And it's really helped us over time to realize, oh, how do we get, it's not about pointing fingers at anybody or even things, it's about how do we get better, and we all learn from different things that happen.
And when you first started measuring this, Paul, were there obvious areas in the process and the steps where you were perhaps weaker, had more opportunity to improve than others? And if so, what were they?
Yeah, the first things that came through for us that were real weak spots were, we all get really excited when somebody signs an offer letter. Oh, great, yeah, the offer letter's signed, and we move on to the next rec. And what we found was the time between when somebody says yes, signs an offer letter, and when they actually start, in our mind, it was like, oh, it's a done deal. It's great. Everything's fine. They're happy. They signed the offer letter. They're going to start. And what we realized was people are still really vulnerable, and they're very impressionable in that time frame. And it was a huge opportunity for us to do a couple of small things that could have a significant impact. Because when people showed up, we wanted them to be like, oh, yeah, no, I made the right choice. I'm fine. Rather than, I signed the offer, haven't heard from them. I don't know. I hope it's the right choice. I'm not really sure. I think I'll figure it out. That was a real eye opener for us at first. We thought done deal, no problem. And we realized, goodness sakes, there's things we can do that make a really big difference.
I recently wrote a post about a hack for candidate experience being setting expectations, as I find that it's often one of the easiest thing to do is just, you have negative feedback because there is either a lack of expectation and misalignment of expectations, but actually informing people of what to expect goes a long way. Did you have any such learnings in terms of those kind of principles where you found like these were kind of, dull moments where it's like, this is simple. Why didn't we do this before? If we just do this, it has a big effect on our candidates.
Yeah, a simple thing like a graphic when somebody applies to say, here's the 4 or 5 steps in the process.
Mm.
What we did is somebody applied, we in text in an email saying, since you've now applied, here's our process, these 1, 2, 3, 4 things. We thought, oh, is this plain as day. But people sometimes, we realize, they skim emails. They don't read them very fast, and we would console ourselves by saying, "Well, if they read the email, fine, it's all there." But at the end of the day, it how they feel makes a difference more so than just because you communicated. If they don't feel good about it, doesn't really matter. You weren't successful. So simple things like putting a little graphic on the website, going, "Oh, here's the 4 or 5 steps," which we already put somewhere else anyway. But having the same thing communicated in multiple places, we realized not everybody learns or grabs the message through an email. Some people learn visually by seeing a step 1, 2, 3. So by covering a couple of those different areas for the same thing, we had a lot more success at people understanding or knowing in advance, oh, here's the 3, 4 stages I'm going to go through.
How often do you review this data? You talked about the steps, the data collected from the candidates, and the different feedback. You talked about how it's shared openly within the team so everyone can learn. Is that a monthly exercise, weekly exercise? What's the frequency there?
No, more often than not, it's quarterly. We started off doing monthly years and years ago and found it was, for one, there wasn't enough change. In the early days, there was lots of change from month to month because we were continually adjusting.
Mm.
But as you perfected your system and as the model got more perfected, we found we opted more to really quarterly. And there's some things that we just do semi-annually because you can only collect a limited amount of information on some stages of the process. We're like, if 35, 40 people respond to this survey, it's like, yeah, it's not really enough to warrant making a huge system change if it's 35 out of 1,000 applications, hypothetically. So we broke down the timing more to how much information do we have, that validates for us whether we need to make a change or not.
Is there ever a question of too much information? Can you ask too many questions? Because obviously, the more surveys, the more options, the more friction for the candidate. So, was there any learnings there around what the sweet spot amount of information to capture is, or is it take as much as you can?
No, yeah, that was a good learning for us because we thought we were completely justified in asking all kinds of great questions at the beginning. And what we learned was that the fewer questions you have, the greater the probability is of somebody completing the survey. Doesn't matter how nicely you've worded it or whatnot, just the fewer the better. We even tried an experiment once of we wanted to, the problem we were trying to solve was how do you increase the number of surveys that are completed? So we had an idea, well, let's incentivize people to complete the surveys. And we found, we offered, for every time you complete the survey, we put your name in a draw, and once a month we draw like a gift certificate to a fabulous online retailer or something like that. And then we track it all to see what were the responses before, and we let that go for a number of months and try. It had a little bit of impact, but what had more impact than anything was to say, we just have one simple question for you and an open text box, and that's all the survey is. That was the biggest indicator of probability for is somebody going to complete the survey. Make it as short as possible, and we actually did away with the incentives because they didn't make a difference once it was like a simple one question survey with an open text box.
Wow. Wow. I question on the stats, like on average, what kind of response rate do you typically get? And would a candidate get surveyed many times in the process or only one at one point in the process?
Oh, it's a good point. um, Candidates could be surveyed many times along the way. Certainly, if somebody applies, they go through the recruitment process and they get hired, they'll get surveyed at multiple points. We try to make it so there isn't overlap, but there could be a little bit of overlap. When you After you start with the firm, like there's automatic surveys in the HRIS system when you've been here for 7 days, for 60 days, and for 90 days. Some of those will go backwards and say, hey, how was your hiring experience? But most of the time, we try to separate it so you don't get the same things twice. But we try to increase the number of ways that somebody has exposure to see that they can give their feedback. For example, the feedback, we're interested in all the feedback, but it's not all of equal value. uh, when you get feedback, and if I get feedback from somebody that's halfway around the world, might not speak English or French, which are the primary languages in Canada, wants to come here, and for all these great reasons, but they might not be at the top of the list as somebody that I'd really want to hire. The type of person, the feedback I get from somebody who's been through the whole process and we hired them, and this is a great candidate, that feedback actually means a little bit more to me because it's more closely aligned with, hey, we think this person will be successful at the firm. Whereas the other candidate's like, yeah, they could be, but they're years away because they're not even in the country yet, or the language barrier isn't quite there yet. They could be there, but today it's not as valuable. So we try to segment some of the feedback into, which feedback is of greater value at which point in time.
I'm kind of response rates. Are you talking about 1 in 10, 2 in 10 overall? What kind
Uh,
of numbers do you think?
it's funny. It goes up and down like a yo-yo, and it even varies by recruiter. Um, a key metric that we look at for recruiters is when they send out we call it's the decline, thanks but no thanks, after you've had a phone screen at least. I have some recruiters that can get 25, 30% feedback, and others that will get 5% feedback. And what we're continually doing is to say, okay, we're not looking at what the 5% what they did wrong. What we're saying is, okay, for you that got 25% feedback, what was your secret sauce? What's your magic recipe? What did you do? And what we find is that there are little tiny things people can do that make a huge difference. So we had one gal on our team where she had twice as many responses coming back as others did at this stage. And one of the things that we learned that she did was something as simple as when she dispositioned people, said, here's why we're going to not move forward. Here's why. She said, oh, and by the way, sometime soon you're going to get a survey in an email. It would really mean a lot to me if you took a moment and completed that survey so that I can get better if I need to, or you can let me know, where I'm doing really well. That simple little task of itself exponentially increased the volume of surveys that people got just by that simple line that that person used.
Wow, I love that contrast between having a financial incentive or a voucher barely move the
Yeah.
needle, but just asking for help and for feedback as a human being was exponential in terms of its impact. That's amazing.
Yeah, made a huge difference, and we learned a lot more from it too. Because uh, some things we go through. Yesterday was a day we were reviewing. It was a feedback we get for people to go through the website. So twice a year we go back and look at all the feedback that people get, and these are people who've applied but might not have been hired. So you went through the whole process. What was your experience on the website as a whole? And there was this one simple little comment that somebody made that we would never have gotten. It's like, well, on your website you say that when I create my my profile, I have to enter a password. It's going to be at least 6 digits long. But when I got to that section, it had to be at least, it said 8 digits long. And what's your problem? And yada, yada, yada. Normally we go, well, not a big deal. But we realized it was a simple little thing like, oh, the ATS vendor had updated their security provisions sometime, and we would have just, okay, fine, yeah, and not remembered, oh, yeah, it's on the site. Quick little change on the way. It sounds small and inconsequential, but what we find is what surveys do is they give you a handful of things like this that one thing in and of itself, that small, likely won't turn somebody off from your brand. But if there's a collection of them that add up over and over, it just gives you a really sloppy
Mm.
perception. And they're really like that one. Before the meeting was done, my technology guy in town attraction had already gone and made the change. And I was like, we would never thought of it. Like you get little nuggets like that. That's like, oh, yeah, that's easy. I can fix that in 2 minutes.
You mentioned that, and you mentioned the image in terms of trying to give people the steps of the hiring process that you learned and put in. Can you share with me any other examples of, key things that you changed in the hiring process, or maybe what behaviors you see different in your recruiting team since you have all this data?
Yeah. So the key, I'll start with the recruiter side of it. The key difference with the recruiter side is what they're realizing is the holy grail for candidates is really feedback. They want feedback. If you can only do one thing in the whole candidate experience, I would tell somebody the single most important thing you can do is give as comprehensive, detailed feedback to a candidate as you can, and honest feedback. And what recruiters have learned more and more over time is the detail of feedback that candidates are really seeking. They would have thought before, well, they would have given some indication of here's the feedback of why we're not moving forward, or here's how you performed in an interview even before you go, and they felt that was great. But the surveys let us know that they needed to give better and more detailed feedback in more specific areas. And so that's really helped change the behavior in that way. That's made a big difference there. What was the
Right.
second part? There was a two part to that question.
Yeah, so the behaviors is one part. Maybe some of the process change. So you mentioned one of the examples earlier on where you put the image in terms of what the process looks like. Anything else where you went, okay, like, or changing the 6 to 8 on the ATS, for
Yeah.
example. Anything else I thought that was like, oh, that's an easy thing we can do. Remove a step, do something else. Any other insights or projects that change there?
The single most important thing we did um, process wise, that's we tried to automate as much as possible, are just automatic notifications. So if you go along in our process, it's typically, you can apply and you'll get a notification, hey, thanks for applying right away. We commit right away to say within the next 3 to 5 business days is how long it takes us to go through everything on average. So you should expect to hear from us within the time frame. So we set the expectation. Then every time along the way, if you move forward from the I've just applied to the okay, a recruiter's now looking at your resume to okay, you're going to have a phone screen to you're going to have an in-person interview. At every single one of these stages, and their statuses in any applicant tracking system. Anytime somebody's status changed, they get an automated notification that goes out to them to letting them know, hey, you've now moved on to this stage, or congratulations, you've now moved to this stage. It happens anyway, and candidates love it. They
Mm,
just like knowing where they are. And recruiters get measured on the amount of time people are in each stage. The goal is we want to move people as quickly as possible. It's not a perfect science because sometimes waiting is the right thing to do. But what's not the right thing to do, we've learned, is you never want to have somebody apply and their resume sits there, and then 2.5 months later, when the role is closed, everybody in the thing gets an email saying, "Oh, thanks, we filled it." You want to let people know as soon as you can along the way. And one of the things that we learned that was also a surprise was we were like, sometimes you go forward with a candidate and you're thinking, oh, this is it, this is great. I've got 2 people here for sure. They're going to make it. You disposition the others because one of these two are going to make it for sure. And then in the end, it's like, oh, those two didn't make it. I had one even for my team. I had to go back to the pool that I rejected. I called this guy up and was like, look, I'm really sorry. I know this worked out, but now I've been through it all. I think I made a mistake. I said, are you open to a conversation? And I've got 2 people on my team like that. Unfortunately, it was me both times that did it. But one's been here like 8 years or so. The other guy's been here 2 years. They give me a hard time. They make a good joke about my mistake doing that. But what we learned from that was you're better off to reject somebody, go back to them and say, "Oh, I'm so sorry I did it. We've rethought it now. Actually, I think this might be fine." People are okay with that, and we make the
mm,
assumption that, "Oh no,
mm.
nobody wants that." But you're better off to do that and go back to them. They're flattered by the fact that you come back and for one, you'll admit your mistake and go, "You know what? Things have changed. Actually, are you okay?" I've never had somebody go, "Well, you turned me off, so forget it. I'm not interested." You're better off to do that than what most recruiters used to do is they would leave somebody hanging for the whole duration and dismiss them all at the end.
Just in case. Just leave them
Yeah,
there because you never know. We might want to go back to them, or one of these two people turn down our offer. We want to have a third in the wings,
yeah.
etc. Paul, our listeners would probably be angry with me if I didn't ask you about tools and tech. Is this all built into your CRM? Did you try different tooling around surveying and so on and so forth? Or what has that journey been around just the products? If somebody else wants to get started, or if it's not a particular product, just how you thought about what the product functionality needed to be.
Yeah, so our applicant tracking system, we use Taleo Business Edition. It works really well for us. I I look through the market every year I go through and I look at what's new in the market, what's not. There's a lot of really good ATSs out there. And I think at the end of the day, there isn't one that is the better than everything for everybody because it depends on your business. I like the one we have because it's an open source concept and we have lots of flexibility in how we configure things. That works really well for us. Some organizations, but I also have a full-time person on my team who manages all the technology of our recruiting
Mm,
team. So I have the luxury of I don't have to go to somebody else in IT and say I want to make a change in our system. It's like we own the system. We want to make a change, we just make a change.
mm.
So it's a bit of a luxury to have that. That allows us to be super flexible in how we configure the system. We learned though when we did surveys that just simple was better. We use SurveyMonkey and we take SurveyMonkey links and we embed them right into the ATS to our automatic notifications, and then we go back to SurveyMonkey to look at stuff. And for the I don't know thousand odd dollars a year, I forget what it is, it might be pinch more that we spend, it's worth its weight in gold. Lots of other tools could do the same, but sometimes I found it easier to have I like the technology that specializes in surveys rather than trying to use, a lot of ATSs will have everything built into them. Sometimes it makes it just a little more complicated, and this way it works better for us.
I love that. Simplify the process, but also simplify the tools. Don't overcomplicate your technology or your process because maybe it just doesn't get off the ground or it becomes too monstrous to try and manage. Paul, in all of this, right? I'm a big fan of candidate experience. You're a big fan of candidate experience, but I'm going to put my business hat on for a second here. What's the value in improving candidate experience? Have you been able to measure that over the years in terms of, I'm thinking about offer acceptance rates, I'm thinking about decline rates through the process, etc. Is there a noticeable difference? Can you quantify it and say, yes, here are areas where we've seen the improvement to the business or to hiring by having a better candidate experience?
Yeah, and we knew that going into that. It's like if we couldn't find ways to measure and do that, then we were just throwing kind of money into the wind. We can absolutely track and measure the effect for the business. A lot of it is on at the campus area. A lot of it we focus on is acceptance rates and the experience we give there, and that's made a huge difference. And we can measure those. That's not a hard thing to measure. What we also do from it though is if I pick on campus as one example, we will go back through and if because the volume is much higher there, we'll go through and if I've got whatever percentage and I, if I'm at 85 90% acceptance rates of offers in one city, we will manually reach out to the people that declined our offers either through us or through a third party consultant, and we will incentivize those people to have a quick conversation with a third party who's usually not us, and tell us about our experience of why they didn't take our offer. And so we'll learn from those, when if the experience is better or not. And we learn sometimes there are things that were totally out of our control, like, oh, I had the chance to work on this thing in this city in this area, and we realized that had nothing to do with our experience at all. Like, and they said, but you really tempted me. It made it hard because of this, the experience factors. That's something that helped us learn a lot that way. We also found we track it with retention rates because if you bring the right people in the door, if we get the experience right in the end, we should have lower turnover in certain areas. So we can track it by which people we bring in the door through which process versus if the business might hire people on their own or if people come in through different transfers or other things. We can track the experience of how well that translates to the business and retaining people. We also look for go ahead.
Go, shoot.
We also look for other ways that we can tell in terms of like how quickly the process goes with the experience. We've found makes a difference in how quickly we get people through our time to fill. But when we deliver a good experience in professional services, one of our challenges is the I call them the gene pools are often pretty small. If I'm looking for very specific niche talent in a specific city, generally speaking, I can count on my fingers and toes the number of people in the city that have that skill, and we usually know where they're working. The difficulty isn't figuring out where could they be. The difficulty is it's the sell. And so the experience we deliver has mattered immensely because we know from when we reach back out to them, people remember the positive experience they had, and we will reference that throughout the process. So the business sees that as more senior people also come in.
As we look forward, Paul, and we read about and we hear about and we probably experience different ways that candidates are applying. We hear scary stories of, and I've seen this in action, candidates using AI to apply for jobs, 2,000 jobs at a time, overwhelming the application flows for recruiting teams. We have a higher expectation on candidate experience, but obviously that costs time per applicant. If your applicant funnel is growing, you're getting more people at the top of the funnel. They all want personalized feedback. We get it.
Yeah.
How are you thinking about some of these challenges? Right, you're aware of the things that move the needle, like giving personalized experience and giving it fast. But you are going to be challenged by the fact that over time you might get more applicants. You're going to have to then decline a lot more folks. It's harder to give personalized feedback. And then if you get more feedback on your side, these are manually entered text-based responses that have to be analyzed, etc. Have you begun to use any technology to try and solve for that, or as a process-wise, or what do you think about the next few years in terms of some of those scaling problems or some of the challenges that will come in? Are there other challenges, Paul?
And I think those challenges are it's not even the future. They're starting now. They're already there.
Mm.
So people like to give their opinions. People like to tell you what they think of, like whether it's your process, your website, whatever it is. What we've recently started to use to help us understand large amounts of information is sentiment analysis. So you can get technology out there that will take large reams of text, and from a high level, for us to go through hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of individual responses, you're right. It's also as the firm gets bigger, it's more and more data. So for really large sets, we tend to use sentiment analysis to give us a sense of like, as a general rule, are people generally feeling, are most responses positive, negative, and we'll go by that analysis. That helps us get through large amounts that way. For other areas, we try hard to make sure we focus on communicating. Hey, here's where we use technology, and here's where we don't. We put a new section up on our website about a year or two ago. We just thought it was kind of a right thing to do. We didn't really appreciate the impact I think it would have. We just called it how we recruit. And we put on there, basically it was like the Wizard of Oz, pull back the curtain. Here's everything we do behind the scenes. Here's all the process, what we do. And like we let people know, for example, we don't use any AI in our assessment and selection process. um, we're experimenting on the sourcing side to see could it help us find things where we're still experimenting. But on the assessment side, we want to let people know it's like, no, it's still real human beings. We haven't we have the luxury in our industry is that I don't have masses of applicants for most of what we do. It would kind of be a problem we'd like to have. At the campus level, you do, but we have enough people that we can take resources from one area, reallocate it for periods of time to help us deal with the volume. But for otherwise, I don't have very few roles am I like overwhelmed with the number of applications we get. Just depending on the market and what we're looking for, because we're quite particular, and so yeah, not as many might apply.
That sounds like a podcast for another day in terms of how we get that funnel right and get it slimmer rather
Yeah.
than too heavy at the top. Paul, as we wrap up, if we have a leader or a recruiter on this podcast listening in, thinking, "I'm sold. I love what you've done. I want to try and get to where Grant Thornton Canada are." Where would you recommend they start, or what's the kind of core thing they should be thinking about in terms of building out what you've done with your team over the last few years?
I think a good place to start is to say, what is the experience we want to deliver? Not just like, hey, let's do a great experience, but define it. Like, what is the experience? A great starting point is to say, what are all the touch points I have? And it might seem overwhelming at first because there could be 25, you could have 30 touch points. You might have fewer, but you could have a lot. And you just start small and say, okay, this year we didn't start off and make a plan for every single touch point in the first year. We said, we did a little survey and figured out, hey, we've got all these 20 whatever touch points. These two or three looks like we're pretty weak. We could do better in these. And so for the first year and two, we just focus on those ones. And then the next year, we said, okay, we've done better there. Let's find where the next weakest spot is. And you just pick a couple each year. You can't, if you think you're going to go in and change all 20 things in 1 year, so you're probably going to make yourself disappointed and you'll run your team out the door really quickly. But get the one or two areas to be the biggest impact, and focus on those one or two areas. And then the following year, pick another two or three. And then another year, pick another two or three. And then over time, you'll gradually get at it.
Paul, if anyone wants to pick your brains further, find out a little bit more about what the team is doing, or hear your insights about what you're looking at next for 2025, what's the best way to reach out and contact you?
Probably just LinkedIn. You can find me, Paul Peterson, on LinkedIn. There's not too many of me in Canada that work for Grant Thornton. Actually, just one. There is another Paul Peterson that works for Grant Thornton in the US, though. I did find out by accident when I got some of his emails.
Don't worry, we're looking for the Canadian one.
The
So
Canadian
we're all
one.
good and clear with that.
We're
Paul,
fine.
it's been such a pleasure to hear the story of you and the team, what you're doing. I think it's commendable. I love the way you've connected to data, the approach you've taken in terms of mapping it out, understanding the touch points, focusing on the emotion, the feeling there as well, changing those behaviors whilst also changing the processes. It's a real roadmap for what a team can do. I think in any industry, in any part of the world as well. I'm really, really grateful to you for sharing with us today. Thanks for joining us, Paul. We'll hopefully hear an update from you as you develop it, as the market changes. And I'd love to hear what you do next over the next couple of years.
Thanks so much for the opportunity. It's been a pleasure.
Tune in next week and we'll hear from Glenn Cathy, where we're talking about how do you become a world-class sourcer.